Okay, so we left off last time, and Socrates and Glaucon had just agreed that they need a particular type of person to be a warrior. Remember, there was going to be a sort of distinct warrior class in the city, and like all the other occupations in the city, this was based to some extent on somebody's nature. So the warriors need a particular nature that suits them in that sort of work, and yet in that nature is spiritedness. They need to be able, as Socrates puts it, to be cruel to enemies. But then the concern is if they're spirited, if they're fierce, if they're even cruel to enemies, how will they stop from being the same way to each other, to the city? How will they not fight amongst themselves? How will they not destroy the city fighting? So Socrates says they need to be gentle towards one another, gentle towards the city, but cruel to enemies. And they decide, well, they need to be like a dog. A dog is like that. It's fierce towards people it doesn't know. It's friendly towards people it does know, even if it hasn't even had really any good experience with them. And Socrates says, and that's like philosophy. And Glaucon is a little sort of not sure, but he accepts it. We talked about last time how that's not really a very convincing picture of philosophy. But that's how Socrates introduces the idea of philosophers as rulers into the Republic. So they decide the warriors, the warrior class needs to be like this. They need to be, again, gentle towards their own, cruel towards enemies. And Socrates says, should we just leave it at that? Should we just leave it at saying that's the sort of nature that they need to have? Or should we explain how they will be educated to have that type of nature? And Adimantus here breaks in and says, I think that's very important to discuss. Socrates says, we don't want to go on for too long, but we also don't want to leave out important things. What should we do? And Adimantus says, I think this is very important, as we expect. Remember, Adimantus was very concerned about education in his speech. So here, when education is mentioned, Adimantus starts speaking. Glaucon fades into the background again. So Socrates and Glaucon, or Socrates and Adimantus talk about education. And Socrates brings up this sort of traditional distinction in Greece in terms of education between gymnastics, education for the body, music. And as the note explains, and as Socrates says, music includes things like speeches. Socrates says, we'll educate them in speeches before we do in gymnastics. And Socrates says, don't all speeches have two forms, a true and a false form? In other words, when you say something, it can be either true or false. So speeches can be either true or false. Adimantus says they do. And so Glaucon, or Socrates asks him at 376e, he says, must they be educated in both, but first in the false? So must the guardians be educated in both types of speeches, true and false, but first of all in the false kind? And Adimantus says, I don't understand how you mean that. And Socrates says, don't you understand that first we tell tales to children? And surely they are as a whole false, though there are true things in them too. We make use of tales with children before exercises. So it's a little bit unclear what he means here by using tales that are false. So is he talking about something like Santa Claus, where you can't really reason with a small child and explain to them why they need to eat vegetables or go to bed or whatever. So you say, oh, Santa won't come, you won't get any presents or whatever. Is he saying something like that we lie to children to sort of motivate them, to get them to do things because they're not capable of reason yet? Or does he just mean more like fairy tales, stories that didn't really happen, that aren't true, that maybe involve talking animals or something, but that are vivid for children, that help them understand a particular point, that serves some sort of purpose in helping to educate them? He doesn't really spell it out, but he says, we'll start by educating them in false speeches. And he says, when they're youngest, that's when they're most plastic, meaning obviously not that they're made of plastic, but that they're most malleable, they're most pliable, they can be sort of shaped the most, they're most open to influence when they're youngest. And Socrates says, so we have to be very careful what kinds of speeches. We have to give a lot of thought to what kinds of speeches they'll hear then. And he says, as it is now, children hear all sorts of terrible things that will be very, very upsetting for them, and it's very difficult for them to deal with these things. And Socrates says, so we need to supervise the makers of tales. We need to supervise the people who tell tales and make sure that children hear the right kinds of stories when they're very young. And so obviously here he's calling for something like censorship. The city will control what can be said. Obviously this was not totally revolutionary in ancient Greece. I mean, obviously Socrates was put to death in part for not believing in the gods of the city. So obviously there was a fair amount of censorship, thought control, if you want to put it that way, in ancient Greece cities. Although we'll see, what Socrates calls for is much stronger than that. So he even much stronger than what was going on in Athens. So he says we need to supervise the makers of tales, make sure that they make the right kind of tale. And Adimantus sort of says, well, and so what exactly are we talking about? And Socrates is somewhat hesitant, and he sort of says, well, in the greatest ones, we'll see what we're talking about. The smaller ones too. And Adimantus says, yes, what do you mean? And Socrates says, Socrates is clearly critical of certain types of speeches, and Adimantus says which ones, and Socrates says, well, the ones that Hesiod and Homer told us, first of all. And he sort of, again, he's very hesitant, he kind of puts it out there, Hesiod and Homer, the authorities, these sort of poetic and therefore religious authorities of ancient Greece. He kind of says, well, that's who I'm talking about criticizing, and kind of gives Adimantus a chance to say, well, then I don't think we should be we shouldn't be criticizing Homer. We shouldn't be, certainly we take Homer at his word, although it's not, Adimantus doesn't say that. He says, okay, what do you mean to criticize? He's open to this. He's open to criticizing even Hesiod and Homer, which is not surprising because he himself had criticized them in his speech. But still, Socrates kind of brings it out slowly, and then he says basically, he says if you don't tell fine tales about the gods, and he mentions, for instance, the stories about Uranus and Kronos, doesn't really go into detail. The stories are, Uranus was Kronos' father, and so Uranus was a god, Kronos was a god. Kronos castrated his father Uranus and overthrew him that way. Then there was a prophecy that Kronos himself would be overthrown by his children, so he ate all of his children. That became a somewhat famous theme in Western art, especially a famous painting by Francisco Goya depicting Kronos eating one of his sons, and so obviously very gruesome. And finally, he was given a rock, told that was Zeus. He swallowed it whole. Zeus went off, grew up, came back, overthrew him using violence. There was a war among the gods. So Socrates says these are the kinds of things, stories that gods castrate their fathers or just overthrow them using violence. He says these are the kinds of things that we can't let young children hear, because if they hear these things, how will that influence them? What will they think? I mean, all of this violence. And all this violence that we're attributing to the gods. We're saying the gods behave this way. And Adimantus says these are harsh stories. These are difficult things for people to hear. So Socrates says, so these are the sorts of things that we can't hear. People will think if the gods can do this kind of thing, then surely I can too. So he basically goes on and he gives other examples of stories about gods fighting. And he says something like, so a few things in this passage. First of all, he says that basically, as he puts it at 377d, he says, Adimantus asked him what should be blamed. Socrates says, what ought to be blamed first and foremost, I said, especially if the lie a man tells isn't a fine one. So here he kind of indicates that some lies maybe could be fine, could be noble, obviously paving the way for what happens in Book 3, where Socrates introduces the idea of a noble lie, a myth or a lie that in some ways is what the entire city is based on. And then he goes on, and when he's talking about Kronos and Uranus, he says, even if these things are true, I don't think we should say them in front of children. So again, he kind of indicates even things that are true, maybe we should suppress that. Maybe we should stop people from saying even true things if it would have a negative effect on the very young. And Adimantus basically goes along with this, and they go on. They say, none of this stuff about gods fighting, all of this will just have a very bad influence on children. And again, Adimantus basically agrees with this. He's basically comfortable with this sort of controls and so on. And then at around 378d, Socrates says, and people can't come back and defend these stories about gods fighting amongst themselves by saying there's a hidden meaning. He doesn't really explain exactly what he means by that, but maybe something like one of the justifications for this was to say, well, there's a hidden meaning, there's a symbolic meaning. I'm not necessarily saying that Kronos overthrew his father using violence, or that the gods are fighting, or so. What I'm saying is that the idea here is that the universe is fundamentally chaotic. Maybe the cosmos, or that nature is violent, new things arise, overthrow, kill the old, that it's kind of a broad, symbolic, poetic way of explaining the universe. Socrates says, we won't accept this because, again, young children don't understand what a hidden meaning is. They don't know how to make sense of this. All they hear are these terrible stories about the gods being violent. And again, there's this kind of implication that what people think the gods are like, to some extent, they'll model their own behavior on that of the gods. If they hear that the gods are fighting, overthrowing each other, using violence and so on, then he says, then they will think that that's okay for them to act that way too. So Adimantus goes on and says, okay, so what sorts of rules are we going to have for how to speak about the gods? And Socrates says, well, we're not going to get into details, but we'll provide the broad models. And he says, first of all, are the gods good? And they establish, yes, we all think that the gods are good. And Socrates says, can evil come from good? And they agree, no, only good can come from good. Good can only be the cause of good, of more good, of other good, etc. And so basically, if the gods cause only good and they don't cause evil, then that obviously that's the first thing that they'll say, that the gods cause only good and no harm, no evil. And if somebody attributes something seemingly bad to the gods, they will have to say that this actually benefited the person. So as Socrates, so they establish that the God, as he puts it, is the cause only of good, not of harm, not of evil. And then as he sums up at 379c, then I said the God, since he's good, wouldn't be the cause of everything, as the many say, but the cause of a few things for human beings, and not responsible for most. For the things that are good for us are far fewer than those that are bad. And of the good things, no one else must be said to be the cause. Of the bad things, some other causes must be sought, and not the God. So here we see this sort of, a little bit of Greek pessimism, the famous story about the satyr who had the special knowledge and was asked what is best for human beings, and he answered, the best thing for human beings would have been never to have been born. If they're already born, the best thing for them is to die as quickly as possible. So life is not actually very pleasant. It's not good. It's something that you would have been better off never having experienced at all. There's a bit of that here. Socrates says the God is the cause only of the good, but that means not very much, because as he puts it, most things that happen to us are bad, not good. Therefore, the God is not the cause of most things in human life. So of course, one thing that obviously is saying that the God is the cause of only of the good. But one of the implications is that the God actually is not actually doing that much in human life then. It turns out that most things are bad, therefore the God doesn't have much of a role in human life. There's just not that much going on. And he goes on, he says, so, when Homer says, for instance, that Zeus has two jars, one of good, one of evil, and he gives out both to people, he says, well, that's not true. The God is never the cause of evil. So you have the kind of... we just talked about the Greek pessimism, the kind of Greek tragic view. Socrates does away with a lot of that. This was, of course, one of Nietzsche's criticisms of Socrates, that Socrates represented kind of the end of Greek tragedy. And you can kind of see some of that here, whereas he says that the God simply doesn't cause anything bad. This idea of Zeus as giving good and evil to people, he says that's not true. The God is the cause only of good. So Zeus, or whoever the God is, causes only good. Okay, so that's the first rule. If the God is good, they can cause only good. And therefore the God is the cause only of good, not of evil, not of harm. The second rule, he says, why do things change their form? And he says there are two basic reasons. One is they're forced from the outside, or the other is they choose to change their form themselves. And he says, obviously, the stronger something is, the less likely it is to be forced by things outside of it, the weather, time, whatever, to change its form. And he says the God is in the best possible condition, right? Therefore, the God would be the least likely of all things to be forced to change its form by something outside of it. So then maybe the God chooses to change his form. And Socrates says, don't we say that the God, again, is in the best possible condition? And therefore, any change that the God may make to his form is changing into something worse. And Socrates says, does that make sense? Would anything ever change from a better form to a worse form? And Adimantus agrees, no. So Socrates says, so therefore the God will never change his form. He'll never be forced to change by time or sickness or weakness of any sort. And he would never choose to change his form because, again, he would be changing from better to worse. So the second rule that they say is that the God will never change his form, again, because won't be forced to and would never choose to because he would be changing from a better form into a worse form. Okay, the third rule is they say, why does anybody ever lie? And Socrates begins by sort of identifying the lie in the soul, which is where he says, basically when you really are wrong about something, when you believe something that isn't true. And he says, when you tell a lie, when there's a lie in speech, that's just kind of a phantom of the other one. He's already kind of defended lying, so it's clear that he's saying, well, that's not nearly as bad. In fact, a lie in speech sometimes that's okay. That's not as bad. But he says a real lie in the soul, to really not know the truth about something important. He says that everybody hates that. Nobody wants to be mistaken, to believe something that's untrue, that's a lie, especially about something important. So he says the God would hate this most of all. Therefore, the God would want to know the truth. Therefore, the God would know the truth. The God would know the truth about ancient things. He wouldn't have to make up lies because he's guessing like poets do because, they weren't there. They don't know. Again, you could argue that maybe the God did. Maybe the God came into being later, but they don't say that. They say the God knows the truth. So he says the God wouldn't lie out of ignorance. The God wouldn't lie because, the God doesn't want to know the truth. And then he says, when is the other time you might lie? As protection against enemies. And they decide, well, the gods don't have enemies. They don't need to lie for that reason. And he says, well, what about friends? When would you lie? Maybe you would lie to friends if they're mad or if they're, for some reason or another, need to be lied to for their own good or their own protection. And Adimantus, of course, you could say, yes, that's right. And so the gods would sometimes lie to people for their own benefit. But Adimantus says, no one like that. Again, remember how Adimantus was so moderate. Adimantus says, no one like that, none of the mad or the foolish are friends of the gods. So they remove the idea that the god may lie to people for their own good. So as a result, then the god simply does not lie. The god would hate the lie like everybody else. The god doesn't want to be deceived about anything. Therefore, the god would know the truth. And the god would never lie because of ignorance or because to protect himself from an enemy. And again, the god would never lie to help human beings, because human beings who need to be lied to in that way, they agree, are not actually friends of the gods. Therefore, the gods would not bother to help them. Okay, so what emerges from all of this? Let's compare this picture of the gods or the god, Socrates keeps using the singular, at the end of Book 2 here with a more traditional Greek story, the tragedy of Ajax, as it was written by Sophocles. Ajax was a great Greek warrior. When at the end of the Trojan War, the other Greeks were deciding who should get Achilles' armor. Ajax thought that he deserved it, that he had been the best. Instead, they awarded it to Odysseus. So Ajax was angry and wanted vengeance. He wanted to kill the Greeks and Odysseus. And Athena knew this, and Athena liked Odysseus, wanted to protect him. So she basically caused Ajax to become insane. He went out, slaughtered a bunch of sheep, took more back to his tent to torture, thinking that they were the other Greeks. Suddenly he came to his senses. He realized what he had done. He was ashamed, not of wanting to have killed the people, but he was ashamed of having killed sheep instead, of having been insane. He was sure that they were laughing at him, so he went off and killed himself. So here we have, obviously, here's the god harming somebody. I mean, the goddess Athena is doing it to protect somebody, but she's clearly causing harm to somebody else, Ajax. So she destroys Ajax. This is fairly common in Greek tragedy, that the gods, for one reason or another, sometimes for very petty reasons of their own, sometimes maybe to help somebody else, but they will go ahead and act to destroy people. So that is out. The idea of the gods harming or destroying people, that's out. And obviously, how does Athena do it in this case? She drives Ajax insane. She basically doesn't quite lie to him, but she makes him lose his mind so that things appear in a way that they really aren't. So effectively, she causes him to go insane. She is responsible for him believing things that aren't true. So she effectively lies to him, and she doesn't quite change form. But you can see that here there's a very different picture of the gods, is deeply interested in what people are doing, sometimes acting to harm them, sometimes acting to deceive them. Certainly, the gods deceiving people is very common in ancient Greek tragedy, and of course the idea of the gods changing form, becoming animals, sometimes appearing to human beings that way, and so on. So all of this is out. So the contrast with the traditional, with a more traditional Greek story is clear. And what does all of this mean? Well, first of all, as we said, Socrates says that for the most part, most of human life, most of what happens in human life is bad, not good, or maybe just indifferent. Because very little is good, most of it is bad. So the gods don't cause that. So the god has a relatively limited role in human life, first of all. But even more fundamentally, Socrates here is saying that the god, the divine, is knowable. It's not mysterious. The idea that you couldn't understand what Zeus was doing or what the gods were doing, that clearly is sort of not even something that he's considering here. He's saying, what will we say must be true about the god, and therefore, what are the rules according to which people have to tell tales about the god? Now, it's true that he sets this up as ultimately for the sake of civic education, and it's sort of basically suggesting that we want something that will be good for the city, we want good models for the people, and yet as he gets into it, he doesn't say, for instance, if you wanted, especially his idea here seems to be that people to some extent base their actions on those of the gods, or what they believe to be the actions of the gods. So you might think that he would say, yes, the gods fight and they're courageous. What he seems to want above all at this stage, and as we see at the beginning of Book 3, people need to be courageous. So why not present gods who fight and who are courageous? But he doesn't do that. Instead, he focuses much more on what reason tells us about the gods. So he doesn't simply say, let's base our ideas of the gods on what is best for the city. He says, let's use reason to see what must be true of the gods, beginning from this idea that the gods are good. Again, there are other things you could begin from. You could begin from the idea that the gods are powerful, or that they're deceptive, or that they're capricious, that there are all kinds of other traditional beliefs about the gods that you could focus on. But he says, let's focus on the idea that the god is good, and is the most good of all beings, and what follows from that. And again, the idea is we can use reason to understand the divine. What reason tells us, if God is good, then reason tells us that there are certain consequences to that. That if God is good, then God must be the cause of good, not of bad. If God is good, then God would not change, or if God is in the best possible condition, then God would not change his form, because he wouldn't be forced to and he wouldn't choose to. So Socrates clearly saying, that the gods are not mysterious; they can be known by reason, and that therefore reason can and should be used to revise our beliefs about the divine. Even authoritative traditional beliefs, the beliefs of Hesiod, the beliefs that are set forth by Hesiod and Homer, these teachings should be critically evaluated by reason and revised if they don't make sense. So again, what emerges here at the end, I mean, obviously these particular rules, the larger picture that Socrates is saying here, that human reason can understand the divine, and that even powerful authoritative traditional beliefs should be reconsidered and if necessary, changed to accord with what reason tells us about what the nature of the divine must be.